This is a brief overview of the pilgrimage I undertook in Japan. It's based on a slideshow I did for the Hornchurch Buddhist group. As you can see from the map, the island of Shikoku is towards the south. It's approximately the size of Wales. I flew to Tokyo, and from there on to Tokushima. The pilgrimage begins not too far from Tokushima, heads west along the Yoshinagawa River, and heads back into Tokushima City. After this, the route roughly follows the coast of the island until it turns inland to finish in the mountains at Temple 88. It's impossible to understand the pilgrimage without some knowledge of who Kukai was. Kukai is responsible for bringing esoteric, tantric Buddhism into the culture of Japan, and much else besides. He was born in northern Shikoku and spent a lot of time walking around the island, which is much of the inspiration for the pilgrimage. The name Kukai comes from the words meaning vast empty sky and deep ocean. This both reflects the beauty of the natural landscape and the quality of the mind of a practitioner. Kobodashai is an honorific title marking him as a great teacher. This is the name he is most often referred to by in Japan. Henjo-Kongo, Virochan's Vajra, was the name he was given at his official ordination, before he travelled to China on a diplomatic mission. Namu Daishi Henjo-Kongo is often chanted as pilgrims walk between temples. Kukai is important for many reasons. He made esoteric Buddhism part of Japanese culture. He brought ritual objects, texts, and practices to Japan. Over many years he found ways to integrate Vajrayana into the existing culture. He made a great contribution to Japanese literature and calligraphy. He altered the power structure of Japan so Buddhism, not Confucianism, was dominant. He administered temples and practical projects to help people. But mostly he was an inspirational practitioner and teacher of the Dharma. Many believe his influence as a bodhisattva is still felt. And he founded the Shingon school of Buddhism. Pilgrims are easily identified by the white clothing they wear. Not all pilgrims walk. I didn't walk the entire way myself, as some do. Many pilgrims use the excellent public transport system, specially chartered buses, cars, taxis, motorbikes or cycles. Pilgrims often combine modes of transport and use the ferries and aerial ropeways as well. The white clothes symbolise purity. There's also a symbolism of having gone forth from the world. The tunic is a shroud, the staff a gravestone, the hat a coffin. In the past this was sometimes literally the case, as pilgrims died en route. Even today there are dangers which you take responsibility for when setting forth. The symbolic Vajra staff and sedge hat are awkward when using modern transport, but are still very practical when trekking. These are the items most commonly stowed in the white bag I, like most pilgrims, carry. A bag of nuts so I didn't need to stop for food, pens, lighters for candles, my kesa, a sort of abbreviated robe, a tube of incense, a juzu or prayer beads, a notebook containing my diary and text for recitation, a nokyocho, I'll explain this wonderful little book later, and a sama fuda, which are prayer slips offered at shrines and to people who offer you generosity. So the temples themselves are an important part of the pilgrimage. Many are beautiful. Sometimes the beauty comes from the care taken in building and maintaining them, sometimes from the resources poured into them, and often from the atmospheric places they're sited. Temples are entered through a gateway, although sometimes when trekking you arrive via a back entrance. The gateway houses fierce guardians. At the gate it's customary to respectfully bow before entering and when leaving. Quite often there are many steps leading up to a gateway, or once you've passed through it. Not all, but many temples are built in high places. Sooner or later, a courtyard area is entered, and the pilgrim washes. First the staff, which symbolises Master Kukai walking with you, is washed and stowed away safely. Then you are free to see to your own needs. In many temples, you can ring the temple bell to announce your arrival. I would usually pause at this point, put my rucksack down somewhere and orientate myself. The first act of devotion would then be to light a candle. From the candle, I would light incense. In this slide, on the left you can see a large stone receptacle for incense. Moving right, there is a glass and metal cabinet for votive candles. The pilgrim can then move on. There's a rope to sound a gong to announce to the main figure in the shrine that you've arrived for worship. Next, there is a container in which to put copies of sutras you've made. At the top of the steps is a hondo or main shrine. Here coins are thrown into a slatted wooden coffer, and a saba fuda, or prayer slips, on which you've written personal information, is placed in a box. Here's an example of a hondo. Those familiar with different forms of Buddhism will notice tantric elements to the shrine, such as strings of vajras and the central mandala. Facing the shrine and to one side, the pilgrim can now offer their puja. The form varies, but usually includes the recitation of the Heart Sutra. My practice was usually to salute the shrine, chant the mantra of the main deity, recite the Heart Sutra. My Japanese is terrible, so I generally did it in English or Sanskrit. Say a transference of merit verse, and finish with a simple arigatou gozaimasu, a heartfelt thank you. Sometimes the main image was closed off in a cabinet, which I found strange at first. Some of these images are over 1,000 years old, made of perishable materials such as camphor wood, and listed as national treasures. Realising this, it ceased to bother me. I could usually locate a photo of the image, and sometimes the hidden nature called more forth from my imagination than if I could see the carved form itself. Devotions were then repeated at the Daishi Hall, a second shrine dedicated to Kobu Daishi himself. I then spend time looking around the temple, maybe making offerings at other shrines and seeing the other features of the place. These are some of the features. From the top left, moving clockwise, there are statues of arahants, enlightened disciples of the Buddha. These were fun as they reminded me of the huge variety of personalities of the Buddhists I know at home. A pagoda, at least some of these seem to be for housing places of initiation. Then we've got a shrine, this one's to Amida Nyorai, the Buddha Amitabha. Some footprints of the Buddha, and then some of the many Buddha images surrounding a temple at Cape Ashizuri Mizaki. Before leaving the temple, I would get my Nyokyoto stamped, to show I had worshipped at the temple. It was also an opportunity to meet the temple staff, who were courteous and often informative. The stamps and calligraphy give a visual reminder of each visit, and Now I'm Home makes a wonderful record of the pilgrimage. Some pilgrims had scrolls. The picture shows some scrolls on a bench drying in the sun. The religion we know as Shinto is also very much part of life in Shikoku. Jinja, shrines to the local deities, are very common. There was one over the sea cave shown at the start of this presentation, many by the roadside, on mountains, and I even found one on the roof of a shopping mall. It was obvious that in some places there was an antagonism with the two traditions, with one taking precedence over the other. But in other places they seemed to be in harmony. Kukai incorporated the local deities in his presentation of Buddhism, sometimes seeing them as local manifestations of bodhisattvas. Travelling. I walked about 500 miles, so this was my main means of getting around. There was usually a strong contrast in landscape. The lowlands were a mixture of urban and agricultural land use, often in very close proximity, and the upland was steep and forested. There was sometimes a middle ground of agricultural land on terraced slopes, which reminded me strongly of Spain. There was a lot of walking along roads. Pavements were uncommon. In this photograph, the wide area is used mainly by cyclists rather than pedestrians, who would usually walk on the extreme right over the drain covers. I've been asked a lot about blisters. I used tape and double socks, and once my feet had toughened up, it wasn't much of a problem. Signs were sometimes confusing, as my knowledge of written Japanese is almost non-existent. I did start to recognise some kanji and can compare it to the script in my guidebook. If kana, the phonetic scripts, were used, I was in trouble. Often there were just little red arrows, which I became expert at spotting. I'm very grateful to everyone who provided signs, officials, volunteer groups, and just concerned individuals. Bus timetables were almost entirely impenetrable to me. Sometimes I'd get on a bus and use the GPS on my phone to see if it was going where I needed to go. If not, I'd get off, walk back, and start again. You don't pay to get on Japanese buses, you pay to get off. Once I got used to it, I thought it was a great system. Ropeways were often spectacular, and sometimes I'd opt to use them. Unlike the buses where I needed, and often got help, I became adept at using the trains unaided. They reminded me of London tube trains, though they often travelled in rural areas. Vending machines are almost omnipresent in Japan. Keeping hydrated was important when walking, especially as it was usually hot. I learnt to clip bottles onto my rucksack straps so that I could drink frequently. Refuelling at vending machines was a ritual repeated several times on most days. I tried a huge array of accommodation. I slept rough, including a night bivouacking in a wood inhabited by curious wild boar. I used cheap business hotels, swanky hotels, temple accommodation, traditional Japanese inns, and lodged with Japanese families. I wasn't impressed by my first view of this hotel, but it was cheap, with good facilities and very helpful, friendly staff. This is a mostly traditional room, but behind the shoji screen is an area with Western-style chairs and magnificent views over the Pacific. In traditional accommodation, there were shared communal baths. I particularly enjoyed this one. I'm not surprised ryokan, Japanese inns featuring ghost stories. The dark corridors can be confusing and disorientating. I couldn't find the light switch in tatami rooms at first. It's in the middle on a cord. I grew to really like these rooms and slept well on the futons. Usually, at least once a day, I would become soaked in sweat whilst walking. It was therefore necessary to launder clothes frequently. Despite the instructions being in Japanese, I managed to negotiate many automated laundries. On other occasions, I had to make do with a sink, and if there was a hairdryer around, it got employed for drying clothes. Toilets in Japan are usually highly sophisticated, as they also provide washing and sometimes even drying functions. The more simple toilets like this are still found in some places. People. The temples were often inspiring, the landscapes beautiful, the culture fascinating, but what really makes a pilgrimage are the people. Many people were shy or it didn't feel appropriate to intrude with a camera, but by not having more pictures here, I'm giving a slightly distorted view of the pilgrimage. Fellow pilgrims, temple staff, volunteers, the people running businesses and the general public all added greatly to the experience. The universal, repeated graciousness and generosity of the people I met was deeply moving and my abiding experience of the trip. The pictures on the left are friendly local residents, the others are fellow pilgrims, including in the top right the very helpful Nandaketu. The natural landscape was a source of great joy. The streams are so clear that pools often seem to be empty of water, despite being up to 2 meters deep. Bamboo groves filtered light in a beautiful way, but their insect life was not always so comfortable. One of the few Europeans I met clambers to a cave above a temple. There are excellent views from here of the cedar-wooded mountains all around. Snakes were both a potential danger and a beautiful sight to see. Natural disasters are frequent in Japan. During my stay, the media reported several problems caused by storm damage and flooding. In tsunami-prone coastal areas especially, signs inside and outside buildings keep everyone aware of the height above sea level and the route to higher ground. I was surprised that an island of this size has so many substantial rivers. The smaller wildlife was fascinating. Crabs on forested mountain trails was a surprise in the south of the island. The moths were large, but as they flitted round my head they were delightful. I'm not sure what the large stinging insects the locals referred to as ninja were, but I was warned several times that they were pretty dangerous. Agriculture is woven into society here. Even in urbanised areas, paddy fields and vegetable plots were squeezed between dwellings and industry. Some plots have been also taken over for harvesting solar power. The Japanese word for meal is gohan. The word for rice is gohan. At first I found the ubiquity of the staple food monotonous, but grew to love the sticky short-grained rice. Several harvests occur each year, and I was able to see all the phases of the process. The booth pictured is a commonly seen facility for processing rice. Rice is woven into the culture here. Not only is it part of every meal, but it's used for making tatami flooring and ritual objects like this naga used in a festival. The landscape itself contributed greatly to opening up my imagination. After I'd finished the pilgrimage, I had a little time to explore the festivals, gardens, museums, galleries, and other cultural delights of the area. Thanks for watching. If you want to find out more about the pilgrimage, then I'd suggest going to Dave Turkington's excellent website, shikokuhenro-trail.com. If you're interested in the sort of Buddhism I practice, then a good starting place would be thebuddhistcenter.com. Thanks again.